Okay. Yeah. So basically, wanted to briefly talk about an effort that's happening at the. I think it's related to somewhere in between the tag and the ping, and Jeffrey can expand on that later. But there's a privacy principles doc that's being worked on the tag repo by a bunch of privacy interested folks. As part of this broader doc, there are conversations about data minimizations and a bunch of principles around that, and essentially that, yeah, sites, user agents, and generally everyone should minimize the amount of personal data that is exposed to the web and being transferred. And personal data means pretty much anything, because a lot of the data can represent things about the user, their choices, the way they interact with the page. So almost everything is their network, their location. So almost everything is considered personal data. The doc also currently defines ancillary uses of data, where the current version of that, basically, so ancillary means non-functional for the non-English, non-native English speakers among you. And ancillary use basically defines that in the current version that the data is ancillary as well. So basically, in the current version of the document, if we have a single piece of data that is both being used for functional reasons, for example, a click event exposes its timestamp, and that is a functional, like there is a functional reason for that, but it can also be used for ancillary uses to report that event and when it happened. Then that data now magically becomes ancillary as well, depending on how it's being used. And I pointed out that issue to Jeffrey, and as a result, this is the second PR on that front that is trying to rewrite that section to address that that discrepancy. And essentially, this PR proposes that instead of defining ancillary data as a result of its usage, we define two types of ancillary APIs. Ones that expose non-ancillary data through other means. So, for example, if we go back to event timing, the timestamp of when the event happened is non-ancillary data, and the event timing API exposes that through a different channel to make it easier for people to measure it without hurting their user's experience. And then we have another type of ancillary API, which would expose data exposes data that is not currently exposed through other non-ancillary APIs. So examples of that would be DNS timing and resource timing, so the DNS timestamps, presentation times in event timing, memory measurement, those kind of things that are not, like, basically new kinds of data that is only exposed for measurement, monitoring, and regression prevention purposes. It should be noted that the fact that some data is ancillary doesn't necessarily mean that it has an outsized privacy risk, nor that it is particularly sensitive. It just means that it goes against those like data minimization principles that are currently in that doc. Regarding the PR, it seems like there is no consensus in the task force that it is okay that the PR essentially says that if we're exposing non-ancillary data for ancillary uses, that is fine and doesn't go against the data minimization principle. And there's no consensus on that. The concern I heard from folks on the task force is that reducing the collection cost would increase data collection, and that would go against what the principle is trying to prevent. Now, if we are talking about ancillary data, assuming that the PR lands in some form, and we have this distinction between where ancillary data is only defined as novel data that's not available by other means, then the current document talks about two potential mitigations, as far as I can tell. One is a user permission to access that data, and the other is private aggregation of that data, although that's maybe part of the PR, and Jeffrey, please correct me afterwards. On the user permission front, in my opinion, that may make sense for info that is either sensitive or require like extra debugging info related to the machine type and very specific bits of information that are like very much personal information of the user. But otherwise, that can be cumbersome and can deter folks from using the right APIs and get them to try to get access to this information by other means. And then that brings us to private aggregation. This is something we talked about in TPAC last year. This can have two potential shapes, at least in the rough sketch that that we have of these APIs from the privacy arena and from private advertising arena. One is an API that is key value based, where the browser, essentially we can have an API that defines the key and the measurement, and that gets uploaded to an aggregation server that like the browser defines metrics based on some like predefined keys and values, where the key is the metric type plus the origin or the URL hash that the metric is attached to. And then the value is the measurement itself. So in this case, if, for example, we were to report, I don't know, DNS times, the key would be, we would have like a dedicated browser internal reporting that defines the key as a DNS metric plus the origin that the host that the DNS is resolving, and the value will be the time it took for the browser to measure this DNS, and that would be sent out to an aggregation server, and run providers or origins could then ask the aggregation server for this data in aggregate, and they will only have access to that in a histogram, aggregated histogram form. And the other potential shape for this would be some form of a worklet where the site can define code that has access to various kinds of ancillary data. And that code cannot talk to the page, but can only output histogram contributions that will then similarly be sent out to an aggregation server. And then those yeah, and then that gives the site more control over what gets reported. Still, the output for this is a histogram. Both of these options would make it hard to present resource-specific data unless we can somehow build a histogram per resource per metric. And I'm not sure that's the case. That still requires some digging into those, like the current proposals and technologies. For sure, this will be a significant shift from what run providers are currently doing, from what browsers are currently doing. But at the same time, if we move to this kind of model for ancillary data, this could also enable us to have access to cross-origin data that currently we don't see due to security restrictions, which don't necessarily exist in the aggregate. So that could be interesting. And yeah, so essentially, I wanted to bring this discussion to the group's attention and gather thoughts on that, because I am trying to represent what we think when talking to the various privacy task force, and I would love to, yeah, I would love to do that with actual, after actually talking to y'all. And yeah, Jeffrey now, but I'll just stop the recording and then we can discuss.